Now, one of the first dichotomies that are typically presented between qualitative and quantitative research is that qualitative research is typically presented as being inductive in nature, whereas quantitative research is typically presented as being primarily deductive in nature. Now, to remind you of what we mean by inductive and deductive, you can think back to the implicative syllogism that we presented in the week where we covered philosophy. Inductive research is typically considered as being the generation of conclusions or inferences from observation. So typically taking a set of observations and trying to infer from them some explanation or build some theory from them. Whereas deductive research is typically taken as starting with a set of assumptions or a theory, some logically consistent set of assumptions, that from it, if they were true, we would deduce that certain things should be observed. And then we would go about seeing whether or not we can observe that. Now, this dichotomy is not strictly speaking true in any shape or form. Although, descriptively speaking, most qualitative research is performed in an inductive manner, and most quantitative research at least has the guise of deductive inference to it. Within qualitative research, oftentimes what researchers do is they capture data and they take what could broadly be referred to as a grounded theory approach. That is to say that they try and capture rich data, descriptions about the nature of the phenomena that they're interested in, and then they try to approach that phenomena without any kind of initial bias from a pre-existing theoretical notion or framework or model, and they try and allow the data to speak for itself. However, within the majority of quantitative research, an approach that is almost explicitly deductive is taken. That is to say, the predominant approach to the analysis of quantitative data is something called null hypothesis significance testing, which we will briefly touch on when we get to the statistical a week where we will cover statistical analysis. And in this, what is typically taken is there is an assumption that there is some null hypothesis that we won't observe a particular thing, and then we test to see whether we can reject that hypothesis. So it's deductive in nature. However, as I say, these two are not strictly speaking as clear a dichotomy as is typically presented. For example, whilst most qualitative research, or often a lot of qualitative research, is conducted in this inductive manner, whereby we try to generate theory and build theory from the observations that we collect, there's no reason why we can't do the same with quantitative data. We could capture, observations of the frequencies of different things that are occurring. We can measure the magnitudes of particular characteristics. We can look at the relationships between those magnitudes. We can do all this quantitative descriptive research as well as qualitative descriptive research, and then try to generate explanations from them. We can try and use inductive inference to try and explain why we are observing the things that we observe. Qualitative research doesn't have a monopoly on inductive inference. And at the same time, quantitative research doesn't have a monopoly on deductive inference. We can, for example, generate a theory as to what kinds of qualities we would expect to observe if we were to conduct a particular piece of research. So, for example, say we had some context or situation, some sort of experimental design that we wanted to create, and we wanted to see how subjects would react to that, but not in a quantitative manner. We wanted to observe the qualitative behaviours that they exhibited. We wanted to try and understand, not how frequently, but whether they would exhibit certain kinds of behaviours in a certain kind of situation. And we could collect qualitative data about that, and we could have a theory that deductively entails that if we set up this situation, we should observe these things if our theory were true. And so we can conduct deductive research using qualitative data and qualitative methodologies. And obviously, conversely, we can do the same with quantitative data. In fact, as I said, one of the strongest types of deductive research we can do is where we have a theory that's so well fleshed out that we can come up with very specific point predictions about quantitative phenomena that we're interested in, about the specific values of phenomena that we should observe were the theory true. So this dichotomy between inductive and deductive, between qualitative and quantitative research, is not as clear cut as is typically presented. Oftentimes you will see this kind of disconnect between the two, but in fact, qualitative research and quantitative research can be conducted in both inductive and deductive modes. And as I said before, typically the process of science follows this kind of cyclical sort of inductive deductive approach where we epistemically iterate the theories that we are building, testing, and then rebuilding and testing further.